morning. So we are ready for a very interesting session today, as we had the others yesterday. Dr. Mark Frankel is our first speaker. He's director of the Scientific Responsibility, Human Rights and Law Program at the AAAS. It is the American Association for the Advancement of Science, where he develops and manages AAAS activities related to the ethical, human rights, and legal aspects of science and technology. He has other duties and other responsibilities. He has contributed to the national academies with this area. Together with Nick, he is a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and he'll be speaking about the scientific societies as institutions for promoting research integrity and responsible conduct of research. So welcome.
Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome back. I'm delighted to be here. I want to thank the organizers for putting this meeting together and for including me, especially Luis Henrique Santos and Sonia for facilitating my invitation. I also want to applaud your efforts to bring in some outside people from outside Brazil to learn from and to contribute to your deliberations. I think that's also very important, and something at AAAS, which, although it has American in its name, is really an international organization. How many of you have heard of the journal Science? Has anybody heard of the journal Science? Well, you probably know that AAAS is the publisher of Science. You might not know that AAAS does a lot of other things related to science policy. I'm getting some feedback when I speak. Do you get the same feedback, or is it just me? It's like a whisper. No? Okay. So I hear myself twice. So we do a lot of science policy things, and one of the things we do is in my shop, as Sonia mentioned, that is the Program on Scientific Responsibility, Human Rights, and Law. So we in my shop, we look at these issues from the perspective of ethics, law, and human rights. To what extent do science and technology contribute, or to what extent do they cause issues or problems that need work? And we do these things nationally and internationally as well. So I'm more from the science policy side. I do not represent Science, the journal, and I have no ability to get your articles published, so please don't come up with your manuscripts afterwards. It's just not going to happen. What I am going to talk to you about today, let's see if this works. Yes, is societies, scientific societies, engineering societies, medical societies, all countries with a scientific enterprise, if you will, have scientific societies. We probably have thousands in the United States, some very, very specialized, and some that are more like AAAS, more interdisciplinary. I'm willing to bet that you have many more in Brazil than are shown there, many more. And I want to talk to you a little bit about the role that they might play in the issues we were discussing yesterday. I also suspect that most, if not all of you, are probably members of a society, a professional society of some sort, perhaps multiple societies. And your graduate students and your postdocs ought to be members of those societies for the reasons that I'll articulate, I think, in just a few minutes. So in thinking about this talk and why societies, I put together this slide. Now, until yesterday, that's what I was going to say, and I'll say a few words about them in a moment, but after yesterday's discussion, it seems to me another reason to focus on societies is as sponsors for the Fourth World Congress on Research Integrity, as we had a discussion yesterday afternoon. Just think about it. If 100 societies in Brazil gave $1,000 or $2,000 as a contribution, you would have a lot of revenue to support this conference. More importantly, you would have buy-in by 100 scientific or engineering or medical societies to be able to say that they are collaborating with you in this effort. So I think they may be an untapped resource, and I'm hopeful that maybe something I say today might be useful to you in reaching out to the societies and convincing them of their role in all of this and the importance of their being visible, if you will, at the World Conference. So let me talk a little bit about the things that I have up there. Why focus on societies? Well, perhaps the most important is that they are sort of the repositories of the culture of the discipline. Over time, that culture has evolved and they have developed into a community of practice. And that practice is guided by things that have come from within, norms and standards that they have developed over time and have transmitted from one generation to another. Also, the scope of the societies. Societies are both national, regional, they're also international. You may belong to international societies as well. So they're very expansive, they're very broad, they include lots of people, membership. Their membership includes faculty probably at every university in Brazil. So that's a large number of people that we're talking about that are influenced by that culture, but also have an opportunity to participate in research integrity matters. And enduring, even members come and go. For whatever reason, the society stays as sort of an enduring organizational face, if you will, of that discipline. Some societies, like AAAS, are publishers. When that is the case, you have another resource, if you will, of standards, of ethics, with regard to publication that come again from the disciplinary societies. And finally, societies can be a resource in a variety of ways. Networking with other professionals, clearly meetings that they may have, annual meetings, regional meetings. They do lots of things, if you will, to support their members. And I'll talk a little bit about that in terms of research integrity. That is, what do they do? Now, let me make it clear that I'm not suggesting that societies replace the role of the university or the government in all of this, but they can be partners. Think of it in terms of, well, maybe we can have a collaboration between a university department of physics and the Brazilian Physics Society, or a university department of sociology and the Sociology Society in Brazil can collaborate in developing curriculum materials, in determining how might the ethics code of this society be used as a teaching tool within the context of research integrity. Or you might have a collaboration between the government and societies. After all, society membership cuts across all the universities. It's not settled in one particular university. So for the government, a society is a vehicle, if you will, for reaching large numbers of people throughout the country at various universities, typically from specific kinds of disciplines. So keep that in mind, that I see the societies as another stakeholder, another actor in all of this, and certainly not something that is to replace any of these other important stakeholders. Now let me give you one example where I think societies have played a very prominent role with regard to research integrity and how that has meant no role at all, basically, for universities or governments. Just as an example. The example has to do with authorship and the order of authorship. This is a statement, as you can see, in 2004 from the American Mathematical Society. And it starts out by noting that the culture of joint research and its publication differs among disciplines. Mathematicians traditionally list authors on joint papers in alphabetical order. But as we know, that's not always the case. Biologists tend to place their PIs or lab supervisors or lab heads last in an author's list, whereas organic chemists might put the lab head or the PI first. And in computer science, the person who heads up the lab is always listed first, and the person who wrote the paper is listed last. So where do you think these conventions came from? They came from the professional discipline, how those practices have evolved over time. In fact, here's a statement from a university, very prominent R&D university in the United States. This is their policy on authorship, on scientific integrity, scholarly publication. Here's what they said about authorship order. The order of authors is a collective decision of the authors or study group. This policy does not address questions or disputes regarding the order of authorship or on publications. It is not possible for the university to define the order of authorship. So there's a case where a university has basically said, we know it is not our responsibility. We certainly don't want the government dictating which scientists should be first, so who's left? It's the scientific society. Now, this is certainly going to become more complicated as we have more interdisciplinary research. As you can see this happening, the fact that different cultures, different societies, different disciplines interact with one another. They have different ideas of what order of authorship might be, but it's still not a decision for the university to make or the government to make. It has to be negotiated, if you will, by the people who are involved. And the people who are involved come from different disciplinary tracks and different disciplinary histories. They have to work this out. But they get their initial cues from the scientific societies when it comes to the matter of authorship. So that's just one example that I wanted to suggest to you where clearly the government and the universities don't have a real role to play, but that role defers to the scientific societies and their members. Now, my focus on societies and the role that they might play in research integrity is not original. I'm not the only person to suggest a role for societies, although I've been vocal about it for a very long time. But here's a report that came out of the U.S. Institute of Medicine in 1989, and it recommended that scientific organizations develop educational and training activities and materials to improve the integrity of research, lots of what we were talking about yesterday. To work with universities in identifying substandard research and training practices that compromise the quality or integrity of research. And to develop practices to promote responsible authorship practices, including procedures, et cetera, et cetera. So clearly others have recognized that there is or there can be a substantial role for societies when it comes to thinking about research integrity. So since I'm going to talk to you about the role of societies, I thought it was appropriate, perhaps even fair, to talk a little bit about what AAAS has done. I'd like to think that we've exercised some leadership in this area over the years. We first became involved in this in the mid-1980s. This issue, as you heard yesterday from Professor Steneck, was beginning to percolate in the early 1980s. And a lot of scientists were in denial. Oh, no, this is not a big problem. There are just a few bad apples somewhere along the line. In the mid-1980s, AAAS received a grant from a private foundation in the United States to hold a series of workshops in the U.S., bringing the scientific community together with others in order to take this seriously and discuss what it means for us, the research community. I think we were the first scientific society to actually engage directly this issue as a serious issue and not one that simply will go away with time. So let me talk a little bit about what we've been doing over the years. I arrived in AAAS in 1986. AAAS was born, if you will, in 1848, so I was not there at the beginning for a lot of reasons, obviously, I hope, that they're evident. But we have, I mean, AAAS has been interested in these issues for a long time because I think they saw sort of a potential tension between the values of science and the values of society, and they sort of recognized this early. One of my favorite finds in looking through the archives at AAAS was this report, which came out of a meeting held in 1937. I don't expect you to read that, but I just want to read the first paragraph of it. This was reporting on the AAAS annual meeting in December 1937. It's quite possible, says this report, that the 101st meeting of the association will be remembered as the beginning of a new era in the association. The most notable characteristics were the fine spirit of cooperation among scientists in different fields, and the increasing sense of responsibility of scientists to society. And then it refers to an editorial in the Washington Post, still a very prominent newspaper in the United States. The editorial said, "The current movement," referring again to this increasing sense of responsibility, "the current movement might be described as an effort to shift from science for science's sake to science for the sake of humanity." So at that time, and perhaps even before then, AAAS was beginning to look very carefully at what it means to be a scientist in a larger society and what role scientists have in that society. Then after World War II, they continued their commitment, if you will, to bridging science and society by revising its constitution in 1946 to include the following: to improve the effectiveness of science in the promotion of human welfare, and increase public understanding and appreciation of the importance and promise of the methods of science in human progress. That was in 1946. And then moving on into the mid-1970s, the association created a new standing committee, the Committee on Scientific Freedom and Responsibility. That committee exists today, and in fact, I am the staff officer at AAAS to that committee. And the purpose of the committee was to encourage and assist the AAAS and other scientific groups to develop statements of principles governing professional conduct, and to encourage scientists to accept their professional responsibilities, both with regard to safeguarding the integrity of science, and with regard to the application of science in the promotion of human rights and general welfare. And then in 1977, just a year after establishing this committee, it amended its constitution to include as part of its mission to foster scientific freedom and responsibility. Noting, by the way, in a report that led to that change, that scientific freedom and responsibility were two sides of the same coin. That is, with the freedom comes the responsibility. More recently, in 2002, we have a new executive director join us, and we revisited, as many societies do from time to time, many organizations do, we revisited our mission, and we made some changes to stress the association's commitment to advance science and innovation throughout the world for the benefit of all people, and give priority to the responsible conduct and use of science and technology. I think this mission is worthy of a scientific society. I think it's one that holds great promise, and I think it's one that's consistent with the missions of many other scientific and professional societies, including those that you have here in Brazil. So while AAAS may have done all of these things, I think you should see it as sort of a reflection of what has happened in many, many other societies if you were to look at some of their founding and subsequent documents. Now, this emphasis, if you will, on societies as a community of practice, which I mentioned earlier, is very important because it tends to promote the notion that as a research community, we have responsibilities that go beyond whatever the government might tell us we should be doing. We talked a lot yesterday about self-regulation and government regulation. The fact of the matter is, the only thing that seems to work, at least in modern civilization, is a partnership. That is, you have some basic government regulation, and then you have self-regulation, whether it's through the universities or through the societies or some other entity. And I think the important purpose in that is that while we understand that there may have to be a basic legal framework in place to protect society or to promote its interest, at the same time, we ought to be thinking a little bit higher than that. We ought to be aspiring to something better than the lowest common denominator, which typically is the law. Don't break the law is one thing. Aspire to something really important and significant is something else. So the role of the society, one of the roles of the society, is to indeed, if you will, try to determine what it is we should aspire to with regard to our work. We don't wait for the government to tell us. We go ahead, and we do this through a variety of different mechanisms, one of which is the societies. And I think, again, just to sum up, the purpose here is to try to create an environment where scientists want to do the right thing, not because they're mandated by university policy or the law, but because it's just the right thing to do in order to do responsible science. So, I think that leads me now to talk a little bit more directly about what I see as a role for scientific societies. As I said earlier, the disciplinary societies are sort of the institutional face of the scientific discipline, the scientific community. And I think it's probably true that generally speaking, when people think about a scientist, whether he or she is a physicist, biologist, whatever the case might be, there is some expectation that they behave in a manner that is consistent with certain standards for doing research in biology or doing research in sociology, wherever the case might be. The expectation is that those standards come from within. They come from somewhere. Where do they come from? Well, as I've already mentioned, they come from the community of practice, the scientific society. And their expectation is that while we might have some real trust in individual members, the fact of the matter is we have certain expectations that they will have been credentialed, they will be competent, and they will be ethical. And that's the expectation. And that comes, if you will, the cues for that, the standards for that, come from the professional community itself or the scientific societies. As I said earlier, I think the societies are very well positioned, if you will, as custodians of the professional values and ethical standards that have been articulated by their members over time and that are transmitted from one generation of scientists to another. Here is something that I wrote back in 1993, just to give you an idea how long I've been at this. I said the following, and I think this sort of sums up where I want to be at this stage of the conversation. Members of a scientific discipline are bound together by similar aspirations, values, and training. A scientist is defined in part by his or her relationship to the discipline. The scientific and engineering societies are distinct institutions, and as visible, stable, and enduring entities, they act as the custodians of the discipline's core values and distinctive traditions. Hence, over time, the behavior of individual members can be, and is, explained by references to their society. So that's sort of the first part of my talk, trying to set a foundation, trying to make the case that scientific societies have an important role to play in our concerns about research integrity. So I want to move from sort of this foundational conversation to some very specifics. What's happening in the trenches? So this is results of a survey several years ago. I have no reason to believe it's changed dramatically, of a little over 200 scientific, engineering, and medical societies affiliated with AAAS. AAAS is also a federation of a number of other societies. And these are the things that they did. It was all related to ethics, everything related to ethics. This is just a list. I'm going to talk about some specifics in a moment of things that they do, resources they provide that are available to their members and for them to take advantage of. As I said, I don't think it's changed that much. Maybe some of them have been even more creative in what they now do than they did back then. Hopefully, most of you recognize those. Perhaps you've even participated or led some of these activities with regard to your society. So let me talk about a few examples that I have identified, trying to come at it from different disciplines as well as different kinds of activities. This is a description from the American Psychological Association about having created an ethics office to support the ethics committee in adjudicating ethics complaints, but that it also offers educational workshops and seminars, provides ethics consultations, and serves as a resource to members and the association in addressing new ethical dilemmas as psychology grows and evolves as a discipline. Seems to me a very important mechanism within a society to do those kinds of things and perhaps even more. Here's an example. This is from the Association of Social Anthropologists in the UK and Commonwealth. What this is describing is a resource that they have for anthropologists who have decided not to go into academia, but to work in non-academic settings. And the focus is on what are the ethical issues that could arise in those different contexts. And they provide this resource, which includes an online instruction for their members. Another example of how a society is trying to cope with these issues. Returning, if you will, to AAAS, in the mid-1990s, we created a series of videos on integrity in scientific research. Probably all of you who have taught, you've used case studies. These are basically case studies, but they are on media rather than on paper. And they provide a vehicle. And they've been used in hundreds of universities, actually throughout the world, in terms of teaching. Just another example of a kind of resource that a society has created. This is a very interesting one. This is the American Anthropological Association, which actually is requesting proposals for small grants in ethics. What it is doing is it's encouraging its members to develop curricula for teaching ethics as part of their anthropological courses, not as a separate standalone course. And it's very interesting what they say at the end of this description. They note that the grant recipients will have 10 months to complete the new curriculum materials. That's fine. That in and of itself would be a good thing for them to do. But they go on and they say the results of which will be featured in the Ethical Currents column of the December issue of Anthropology News, as well as on the AAAS Ethics blog and highlighted at the annual meeting. So they didn't simply stop at offering grants to their members to produce these curriculum materials. They indicated they were going to make an effort to make those visible, take the initiative to make sure the members within the society were aware of what was going on and what had been produced. Here is something at a somewhat larger scale. This was a program that ran in 2002 to 2006 in the United States. It was a collaboration between ORI, that's the government, and the Association of American Medical Colleges, which is a nonprofit entity representing medical researchers and institutions. And basically what they did was they offered grants to the societies to develop some sort of ethics activity. It could have been materials, it could have been developing case studies, it could have been a program at an annual meeting. And they had various size grants, and I think some of them may have ranged up to $50,000. That would allow their members to produce these kinds of activities and things. So again, I think this is another resource, and one is a good example of a collaboration, as I said, between the society and government to reach many more people than the government could itself, and with the funding from the government, enable the society to make these kinds of grants. Just an excellent example. Another example, drawing from AAAS, but this is true, I think, in a lot of societies. We give an award for scientific freedom and responsibility, and the purpose of this award, which is presented annually at our meeting, is to honor scientists and engineers whose exemplary actions have served to foster scientific freedom and responsibility. And many other societies do give similar kinds of awards. It's a way of drawing attention to those people who have done something really positive in the area of scientific freedom and responsibility. But there's also a second purpose, which is noted here. We hope that the presentation of this award will inspire the next generation of scientists and engineers as they begin their careers. So it has another purpose besides recognizing somebody, if you will, for his or her good deeds. It goes beyond that. It's simply pointing to what that person did as a role model. It's telling younger scientists that this is somebody that you might want to emulate. He or she is a model. So it draws attention, if you will, to people who have done really good things, exemplary things, that the society awards and acknowledges, indicating its importance, but also sending a message, if you will, to others in the association that, look, this is something we do value as a community, and we'd like to see you perhaps follow in those footsteps as well. My sense is that you probably will do more to inspire your students by pointing to these exemplary people than pointing to all the bad cases we heard about yesterday, but that's open for discussion. Now I want to turn my attention a little bit to talk a little bit more about content for research integrity and the responsible conduct of research. One of the themes of the meeting here is accountability. How do we as a scientific community hold ourselves accountable, and how do others hold us accountable? And I think there's a very important role for societies, universities, and the government in all of this. Obviously, I've been emphasizing societies, but again, this is certainly something that's applicable to others. But I want to talk a little bit about content and what we ought to be teaching, because I have a very particular perspective. There are, I think, basically two types of responsibilities that scientists have. One is upholding the standards that are agreed upon by the community of practice. These are the kinds of things we talk a lot about when we talk about misconduct and research integrity. Don't plagiarize, don't fabricate, acknowledge your colleagues, et cetera, et cetera. You know all of those. I want to call those scientists' professional responsibilities because I want to distinguish them from the second set of responsibilities, which are toward the larger community and call scientists social responsibilities. It's my opinion that our CR training, our research integrity training, must include instruction and education on the social responsibility of scientists, just as includes education about what you ought to do in the lab or in the field to make sure that you're acting responsibly in the conduct of your research. Let me explain why I think that's essential. This is a statement in 1999 from someone writing in Nature, talking about a new social contract with science and society. And he wrote that experts must respond to issues and questions that are never merely scientific and technical, and must address audiences that never consist only of other experts. Science must now be sensitive to a much wider range of social implications. That was written in 1999. I would venture to guess that most of you would agree with me and say that's even more true now than it was in 1999. I think there are increasing demands by the non-scientists in our world for greater relevance and accountability on the part of scientists. And I think part of that comes from what people view, non-scientists view, as our broader social responsibilities rather than our professional responsibilities. I didn't say all of it, but I did say part of it. Moreover, as you well know, scientists is global, and all of us, no matter what our profession, are citizens, if you will, of a global community. We're not just educating scientists, we're educating scientists-citizens. And no society can afford to educate our scientists, our future generations, without telling them how the methods and techniques of what they use have effects and generate benefits or harms for others. In other words, it's not just so much what we do, but for what do we do it, and with what impact does it have? Those are the social responsibilities. And I think both societies and universities have important obligations to make sure that that's part of the education of the scientific community. While I think research integrity and research responsible conduct of research courses are excellent places to include that, it could certainly be included in other kinds of courses taught during their education. This was recognized a few years ago by sort of the leading institutional face, if you will, of graduate education in the United States. This is the Council of Graduate Schools, in which it said in a report, graduate programs have a responsibility to prepare future scientists for the social responsibility that goes with being a scientist. So again, I'm not alone, and I didn't originate this idea of social responsibility as part of the instruction that goes on in graduate education, but I do think it's very important to point out that others have as well. Furthermore, as I said earlier, all science involves communities of practice, different disciplines, different communities of practice. And as noted here, every community is framed by communal values and ethical responsibilities. And these ought to be made clear by your students as they enter into your profession, your discipline. When students choose a field of study, they take on a lot of responsibility. Granted, they want to be good scientists, technically speaking, but there are other responsibilities, those social responsibilities. And I think in order for them to understand their place in the larger society, they have to understand what role their discipline faces as part of a lot of different disciplines in moving or advancing science and technology and public well-being. I think this is incumbent upon us as educators to basically give them a sense of sort of the values and ethical issues associated with their discipline, whatever it might be, and how they might deal with that as they enter the community of practice, if you will. This is what it's part of what it means to be a responsible scientist. It's not simply being a technically competent scientist. So in essence, what I'm suggesting is that there's a considerable overlap between research and social responsibility. And I think it's reflected, if you will, in the Singapore statement. I think it was referred to several times yesterday. In the preamble, the statement says as follows: the value and benefits of research, that is, the values and benefits to the larger society that scientists provide as part of their social responsibility, are vitally dependent on the integrity of research. That is, being technically competent, doing science the right way. The synergy is there. They are intimately connected. The notion of divorcing one from the other makes no sense to me when it comes to thinking about education. So, in terms of education, what should we be doing? What messages should we be giving them with regard to social responsibility? I think it's probably clear what we should be telling them about plagiarism, fabrication, and falsification. Don't. But what about social responsibility? So here are my thoughts about what we ought to be doing with regard to the messages we should be giving to our students with regard to social responsibility. Try to be clear about their own values and that of their profession and discipline. Even when thinking about who they want to go to work for, who do they want to be their employer, think very clearly of what their expectations are about the ethics, the culture, the environment of the workplace, and what that organization, company does with whatever it produces. Next, be sensitive to the values held by others. This means to listen very carefully. One of the biggest mistakes we have made in the U.S. scientific community is underestimating what others think about the work that we do. Too often we assume that what we do is good, and everybody thinks it ought to be good. Sometimes we promise too much because we didn't listen carefully to what others were saying. So this is, I think, extremely important when interacting with others outside your discipline. Important to listen to them. They have something to say, and it ought to be respected. You may disagree, but they have something to say. Understand the social complexity of the issues they will face. Try to inculcate in them a real understanding that doing science is messy, it's complicated in the lab and in the field, but think about its use in the larger society. Think about it. Give some thought to what it is you're doing and how complex it is, and how, to a certain extent, any new intervention with science and technology will likely benefit some people and perhaps put others at a disadvantage. That's just the way it goes, and please understand that and think about what your responsibilities might be. And then cultivate the confidence, insights, the tools, the skills needed to fulfill their professional and social responsibilities. It's not enough, as I said, to tell them, don't plagiarize and don't fabricate. Rarely have I seen a student shout how inspired he is to be a scientist because they've been told not to plagiarize and not to fabricate. What you want to try to do is inspire them to do really good deeds with what they learn and with their skills. And I think the opportunity to teach about social responsibility is an opportunity to do just that. So let me conclude by a couple of statements. I think it's probably going to be true that the public perceives, understands, and appreciates or criticizes science a lot on the basis of what we do, as how we go about our work, how we treat animals, how we treat human subjects, how we treat data. That's not likely to change. That perception is still very important and exists. But neither are calls for greater public accountability on the part of scientists likely to change either, especially when increasingly science is embedded in just about everybody's lives in one way or another. And it's interesting to note that certainly since World War II, but even more recently, I think, a lot of people have used science and technology, or the findings of science and technology, to advance their cause, whatever it might be. In some cases, we might view that as legitimate. In other cases, we might say, well, they've distorted the science, so forth and so on. The only reason I make that point is because it seems to me that increasingly people are realizing, hey, science and technology are important. I want to make sure my voice is heard, and I get involved. And I think this is happening increasingly, and because of that, I think issues of relevance and integrity are gaining in importance. What is likely to change, however, is how we respond, how we handle the threats to scientific integrity, both from within our own professions, but also from outside, and how we demonstrate both to ourselves and to the larger society that as scientists we accept responsibility for what we do, and we expect others to hold us accountable. We don't shy from it, but we expect others to hold us accountable. So at this point, I think I will stop, and the AAAS mascot, who I'll introduce here, and I would be happy to continue this conversation. Thank you very much.
So, Mark, first, I think we are all interested in learning about the composition of the IRB that approved the experiment that produced this mascot.
It was actually the intellectual property lawyers who had more to do with it than the IRB.
I think you pointed to an important aspect of the role of the societies that could be of relevance for the upcoming conference as well, and for the way you're planning to spread the word and the central message of the entire enterprise across Brazilian science. And that is, it is about scientists. It's not about university-based academics, if I understand you correctly. In fact, you quoted one example from the social anthropologists, where the colleagues in one specific field were addressing precisely that majority of graduates and postgraduates that end up beyond the confines of the campus. I think if we want to create a science culture that is based on research integrity, we must be careful not to consider the discourse of research integrity as one that is about internal university management at all. I wonder whether you could comment on that point. The second point is about the feasibility of using a critical moment in reflections of a national science community as moment of leveraging these societies. Just a quick episode I wanted to share with you where within 2 to 3 months something we thought quite remarkable happened. We had to face in Europe a couple of years back severe threats of budget cuts across all sciences. And we tried to lobby against those cuts in various forms and fashions, with more or less success. We felt with less success. What made a difference at one point was when in a last desperate act, we thought, well, perhaps if we gather the scientific societies that exist at national level and that are increasingly also collaborating at European level and let them speak on behalf of their disciplines rather than let university academics speak on behalf of their institutions, politicians would listen, precisely because the societies bridge the environments of academia and science serving already other organizations, government, industry, and so on and so forth. And it worked. And all of this was possible thanks to decent networking, which you are supremely capable of, and using a little bit of pushy emailing, 2 to 3 months, and it can be done. And the World Conference with this particular topic would be, I think, a golden opportunity to energize the existing societies, some of which you portrayed on one of your slides, and create a strong network of supporters across the disciplines. Because let's not forget, there are commonalities across what research integrity means in daily practice in science, but there are also specificities that depend on the different disciplines. In order to capture that, in order for not everything to be stirred into one soup, it is important that the distinctiveness of the disciplines are represented in the discourse that you want to develop across institutions and across the different states. So I, for one, I'm very happy that Mark was able to give us this portrayal of the role of societies in the US as an example of what they can achieve. Yes, it has taken you 100 years, but a lot is possible in 2 to 3 months.
I certainly hope so, especially in digital age. To respond to your second point first, and hope I remember the first point, there's no doubt that societies can be leveraged, even with or without money. They are a vehicle, obviously, for announcing, for disseminating information about the Fourth World Congress, by encouraging people to attend, by perhaps offering scholarships to their students, either directly or through the conference organizers. There are a lot of things that you can do. You have to make a compelling case. I think you can write such a letter to the heads of all of these societies in Brazil, or as many as you think worth contacting. And out of X numbers, and you have hundreds of them, I'm sure I would not be surprised if many came on board in one fashion or another. So I think they are points of leverage. With regard to your first point, yes, when I talk about the research community, I'm talking about writ large, not just those in academe. People who decide not to go into the academic world have perhaps different kinds of issues to face, and they should understand those as part of their graduate training. Not everyone is going to end up at the university. So I think that's part of what research integrity and RCR is all about. It's about dealing with research in various different contexts, and it's important to be expansive in thinking about that. So I hope I've responded to your core points. Other questions or comments?
First, thank you. It was a great talk. I am thinking about many things.
I added to your list.
Yeah, I have to be. I'll try to focus only on one point among the several that I have in my mind. But this relationship between the responsible conduct of research and the idea of social responsibility of researchers is increasingly closer. We notice this even when you discuss corrections and retractions, the responsibility that we have with the data that is exposed to everybody and the impacts that these problems have on the public trust in science. So there are many examples that we could use to illustrate what we've just said. And, but when I think broadly in terms of collaborations between, developing and developed countries, for example, and I look at this particular issue, we obviously see that there are differences in the way they address this problem. In many developing countries, they even do not have the opportunity to think about it, to discuss about it, because they need funding for research. They need to survive as researchers. They need to attract collaborators so that they can do something useful for their country and for their community. But apart from this, my question is, AAAS has been discussing for a certain time. I have read some materials about this, about the issue of science diplomacy. And when you talk about science diplomacy, okay, many issues are involved, but in this context of international collaborations, I think that there are some issues in science diplomacy that have to do with this idea of social responsibility and the way researchers from different countries with different opportunities to do research, the way they interact. My question for you is if AAAS has any role in raising this issue of social responsibility and the responsible conduct of research when they address, for example, the topic of science diplomacy in collaborations. I'm very curious about this.
Well, I am not directly involved in the program that you're referring to at AAAS. They do, as you know, publish a journal, which has included some articles on looking at the broader role of science in society. Clearly, for me, science diplomacy means a number of different things. as it might reflect on social responsibility. But you know, science, if you will, we like to think that science can contribute to social development, to human rights, to a variety of things throughout the world, and that it can be a tool for advancing diplomacy, for advancing bilateral agreements, multilateral agreements. It's understood from people in the State Department that many people in other countries are very interested in what we, the United States, can give with regard to our scientific and technical expertise and resources. And I think when we take graduate students from other countries, we see this as part of our global social responsibility, wanting them, encouraging them to go home and help uplift your country's situation, help contribute to your country's use of science and technology into its enterprise. And I think certainly governments are very aware. Our U.S. State Department has several hundred people working in units dealing with science and technology. It's just inevitable. So I think we're all very aware at the policy level of the importance of science and technology. To some extent, the scientific community is. We're educating them a little by little. But we certainly encourage scientists to engage in bilateral research, to host visitors from other countries, to go overseas. This is all part, if you will, of getting scientists more engaged in their broader responsibilities. I think this is an area where diplomacy and social responsibility could be further developed, where we could use good examples and cases and talks from figures who are coming from different roles to talk to us about, talk to our students about how science can really engage the international diplomacy community. So there's work to be done, but clearly that's what we're trying to develop at AAAS, but it's a new program, but nevertheless that's part of what we're trying to do. You'll translate what he has to say?
I don't know. I want to stand up when I raise this question for Mark, and he probably is not anxious that I'm standing up and asking a question right now. I'm going to preface this question by saying that you need to understand that many of the things that Mark talked about up there are the result of what Mark has done over the last 20 to 25 years, I don't know how many years it is, to engage the professional societies. Mark in particular and the AAAS in general have done an enormous amount to raise these issues and get them discussed by the professional societies. So what you heard is Mark's optimistic, inspiring talk. You didn't hear the talks that he gives to the groups of professional societies telling them, here's what you have not done and here's what you need to do. And as an example of that, he gave you the example of the ORI program to professional societies. That's a program I actually started when I worked at ORI, and the program ended because we didn't get enough applications. So it was good in what we did. We had some wonderful, wonderful projects, but we really could not engage the professional societies. So my question to you, Mark, is how do we actually engage them? You've given an inspiring talk of what they can do, but you know as well as I do that the record is very mixed. There are some wonderful examples, and there also are just a lot of societies out there that haven't done a lot. So could you write a question, or could you write a letter to all of the AAAS societies and say, we have supported this conference for the last X years. Can you please write me and tell me, will you send a delegate? How many delegates would you send? Would Alan send that letter from the top of it? How do we get the top societies in Brazil to actually get their members to participate at this point? Because there are some wonderful examples out there, but there just aren't enough examples. So what are your suggestions to actually do more and get them engaged?
Well, Nick is right. I do have another, you know, I said two sides of the same coin, freedom and responsibility. Well, there's the good and the bad, and I do have other talks which take the societies to task for not doing enough and certainly not evaluating what they do. I do think this whole notion of focusing on the World Conference for a moment, I do think that the best chance you have of reaching the societies and making a difference is if you know somebody. If you know somebody who's active in the physics society, let's say, can you tell that person, look, I want to write to your executive officer, your president, and I want your help in sort of casting, the letter. I want your help in making sure he reads it and he responds to it. That's the best way. Personal contact is the best way to do that, if you can. I find that that works more effectively. You get their attention. You're sure you get your attention. And you have many people working throughout Brazil who are active in societies. Hopefully you know them, you can approach them, so forth and so on. But that won't be the largest majority. Clearly you won't have those kinds of contacts. It would be nice to have a letter written by somebody, and I don't know who it should be in Brazil, whether it's the head of your national funding agency or whoever, or multiple funding agencies, write and say, we're supporting this. I saw they're on the list of supporters. We want, we give lots of money to all of you to do these kinds of things. They may or may not give grants to the societies generally. I don't know how it works here, but they give grants to their members. If you could get that kind of letter, I would think that would be perhaps more persuasive than if it came just from the conference organizers. And I can get Alan Leshner, who happens to be our CEO, to write that kind of a letter, as he did for Singapore. But knowing somebody in the societies who's active and supportive is one way of perhaps getting it to trickle up to who has to do it. There are a number of different ways you can engage societies more generally, and it takes a lot of time and effort. Try to remember that the societies are a reflection of their community of members, okay? You know as well as I do that it's hard work to convince scientists generally that this is important stuff, and they ought to be making it integral to their work and to their teaching. We've made inroads over the years, the decades, if you will. It's no longer years, it's decades. We made inroads. But it's the same issue. It's not an easy sell when they have so many other, quote, priorities on their desks, and resources are never enough. So you have to keep at it. You have to keep at it by talking to them, by helping them organize sessions at their meeting, by advising them on developing or revising their code of ethics. There are lots of things we do at AAAS to try to provide help to these other societies. Some of them work for the short term, not the long term, so forth and so on. So it's no different than trying to generate research integrity and RCR activities in the universities. It's the same people. They belong to the universities, they belong to the societies. But I think you could focus on the societies, have a good plan in place, and people help execute it. And I would be very disappointed if you didn't have a large number of at least Brazilian societies on board. I would like to see Latin American societies generally better represented. But think about who should be writing that letter and how you can cast it in a way that is likely to appeal to some of the things I said today about what they should be doing. Okay, I'll stop there.
Professor Luis Henrique at FAPESP agreed that it could be a good idea to talk directly to Professor Helena Nader, who is the head of the Brazilian Association for the Advancement of Science. In fact, she said she would be here yesterday. I don't know what happened, but she responded to our letter, and I think that she's interested in helping and to cooperate with the conference, because she had already said this when you said that Brazil will be hosting the conference, and when we invited her for this meeting. So I think she's interested in collaborating. And what we talked yesterday was that if a letter comes from her to our we have more than 100 societies affiliated to SBPC. So I think that they would, of course, do something, right? Perhaps sending the heads of their societies. So, but for this specific organization, I think Helena Nader will be the best person, especially because she's very concerned about this topic. She has demonstrated this. So I think your talk is perfect to corroborate the idea that we have to talk to her and the issue that Nick has just raised. So I think that's the path that we have to take.
for the societies.
Yes, and keep in mind that it may well be strategically that that kind of letter should never mention something about financial support, but rather should talk more generally and say, you will be hearing from so-and-so, the lead conference organizer, whoever, and I hope that you will respond to her request for support or something like that. Think strategically about what that kind of letter should say and what she's willing to say, but at least to introduce and prepare the recipients for a request from support is something that would be terrific, I think. There was,
yeah. This is a remark to everybody. Be warned that at the end of my comment, I will ask you, those of you who are actually members of societies, to raise your hands. So prepare for that moment and be ready to show your involvement in the existing societies. But as is usual with me, I'll give a lengthy comment first, so you have time. A very practical suggestion.
Too lengthy.
A very practical suggestion, maybe. I'm no longer so familiar with the Brazilian system, but I remember the times when your colleagues were touring Europe and the US promoting the Lattice system, which basically captures pretty much the existing scientific community. Now, I would imagine that some of you, if not all of you, have access to that database of researchers, which gives a profile of these people, not just colleagues of yours, not just in terms of publications and affiliation, but also in terms of service to the profession, if I recall correctly. If you just go through the list of participants at the 3 very successful BRISPE meetings, you will have a panorama of colleagues, and we will see how many, in the societies that are already deeply engaged in this particular topic. So if in a similar vein you approach those colleagues who are already engaged in this conversation at a national level and ask them what are the specific debates that have been going on in their associations with respect to research integrity, you get a better grasp of what might or might not capture the imagination of the president or chair of such a society, and then approach them, yes, with a standard letter, but plus a specific paragraph addressing their core interests, be they biodiversity researchers, be they social anthropologists, be they astronomers, or whatever else. That was what made it possible for us to mobilize 150 societies within 3 months. A standard letter alone would not have done it. So then a little bit of preparatory work has to go into this. Authority alone is not enough. So that just as a suggestion. And now the question. So can those of you who are members of any of these scientific societies here in Brazil raise their hands, please? Okay. So you guys know the people, I don't. You know who to talk to in the coffee break later on, right? Okay, thank you.
Yesterday, I heard a very strong negative viewpoint about the possibility of scientists self-regulating themselves as a group. And today, your optimistic talk seems to suggest that you think it would probably be eminently possible for scientists to self-regulate themselves. Would you like to comment on that difference?
Yeah, the expression I would use in English is it's sort of a mixed bag. Historically speaking, when it comes to science, scientists have always wanted to remain autonomous and independent. They have always thought that government intrusion would be a disaster for science. That doesn't matter where you are, what country you're in. Historically, this has always been the case. Historically, it's always been the case that scientists have messed up, that there's something, and you heard about them yesterday, the scandals, the problems that we've had, and we've indicated we haven't earned the right to be totally self-regulatory. We haven't, and no profession has. No profession has. Ultimately, what happens is that there is some regulatory apparatus that is established by the government with public support, the lowest common denominator that I mentioned to you very early in my remarks. That's the law, okay? It's there presumably to protect people from us, scientist, whatever the reason the cause might be. It happens. Now, I think that's inevitable. It's certainly, historically, it's shown to be the case. All sorts of areas of science are now regulated. I mean, there's just no doubt about that, especially in Western societies, but all over the place, I think that's the case. But in the context of that, there are lots of other things that are not regulated, okay? The government does not regulate who's to be an author on a paper, what order the authors are to be in. Okay, that's not regulated. That's regulated by the professional community. It may be through a journal, which is part of the professional community. It may be through a society or some combination of the two. But that's an example of self-regulation where it works. And it has worked so far, not to suggest that there haven't been disputes and problems. So there are areas within the context of the regulatory framework where science can regulate itself. And I think those are areas that we can sit and talk about and identify, but you probably know what most of those areas are. But that requires a greater sense of responsibility and accountability in those areas. That's inevitable. It comes with the autonomy and the freedom to make those decisions yourselves as a community. So I don't think it's self-regulation or regulation. It's some combination that we learn to live with, if you will, and if it doesn't work, we tweak it, at least in democratic societies. That would be my answer to that.
I think I have to give you right of first response.
Can I get it short? I'd just like to respond briefly. I think authorship is one area where the professional societies have failed miserably. And they have failed miserably because they've looked at mostly their own internal needs. They've kept their own in-house policies, which you kind of wink at and say, well, we know so-and-so belongs here. What's the primary purpose of authorship? If you're conversing with the public, it should be to give a clear indication of who is responsible for what. And when you go back and forth between fields, people work in different fields. So this time I'm a material scientist, this time I think they've actually failed miserably in the area of authorship.
Well, let me say that I'm not sure I would characterize this failed miserably. There are problems. I think they've gotten better at it. But we have an expert on publication ethics who's going to speak later today, so I'll defer to her.
So thank you.
Oh, thank you all very much.
Professor Nick Steneck, for those of you who were not here yesterday, Professor Nick Steneck is an emeritus professor at the University of Michigan. He used to be a consultant for the U.S. Office of Research Integrity. I think he was there for more than 15 years, 10 years. Yeah, and he's the director for Research Ethics and Research Integrity program at the University of Michigan. Nick is the responsible for the creation of the first World Conference on Research Integrity and has chaired the first, the second, and collaborated with the third, and is with us for the fourth. And he'll talk about institutional policies to foster the responsible conduct of research, focusing on the role of universities.
Thanks again to the organizers and everyone. I see some familiar faces here from yesterday. So you've heard some of the things I have to say. I'm going to talk a little bit about, more specifically about universities today. And I'm actually going to focus mostly on education or training. So actually I've changed between yesterday and today. I've taken off my tie. I put on my jeans, and so this is the teacher in me talking today, not the policy person, and so on. And it's what I enjoy doing most, is the teaching and working with researchers along the way. I'm going to change my title slightly at this point, and that is there aren't a lot of policies actually for fostering, so I'm going to talk more about the efforts of universities to foster. And this is one area where I actually have to declare my conflicts of interest because I do work for a private company that does training. So in the interest of integrity, I need to declare my conflicts of interest. I do not work for tobacco companies, pharmaceutical companies, and other things like that, but I do work for a private company. And I do that because it actually gave me resources that I couldn't get as a normal academic to do what I wanted to do myself. So But I'm not going to talk very much about what I do. I'm going to kind of end with one thing, but not too much. So with that, yesterday I talked about the RCR dilemma, and that is that there's a range of behaviors out there, and there's quite a bit of activity that goes on in research that doesn't reflect high standards for integrity. So the question arises at the point, what are the main problems out there that we need to address? So we're fostering integrity, but which problems should we be addressing? Because we only have so much time, what should we be doing? And then once we've identified what the main problems are, what should we do about it? So that's kind of what I look at this point, is how do we sort through the problems and decide what we should do? And then we want to talk about that within the context of universities. And it's interesting that universities are very different when you go from one to another. You know, some are in cities and you can fairly find their buildings, and some of them, like in the US, sit out there in the midst of nowhere, and you come to the university and you know it's there. My university is huge. It's, I think, something like 7 or 8 miles from, 12, 14 kilometers from one side of my university to the other side. Our football stadium is larger than all of your soccer stadiums. I think most of your soccer stadiums, I'm not sure there are any that are larger anymore. And then there are very small universities out there. So there's a lot of diversity when you start talking about universities. But when you look really at the details of universities, the basic positions and organizations of universities when it comes to integrity are almost all the same. So there's always somebody at the top of it, a president, a rector, they got all sorts of names, but there's somebody who sits up at the top, and that somebody then delegates authority down to somebody who's in charge of the research. So when you're looking at a university, the first thing I do when I'm looking for integrity policies is I go to the research office, and it's there that I'm likely to find what's going on in integrity. And under that, there's usually somebody who deals with the regulatory aspects. It may be one person, but at the University of Michigan, it's probably somewhere between 75 and 150 people who deal with regulatory issues, depending on what you count. And then there may or may not be somebody who's involved with training. You'll see more of that in United States universities because we have required training. So somebody has to have responsibility for that. And then universities, almost always, the ones we're talking about, have a graduate program. Sometimes the graduate program and the research programs are by the same people. Sometimes they're separated on out. It varies. I think at my university, about every 10 to 15 years, we change. So we bring our graduate dean back under research, and then we move our graduate dean back out of research, and then we move them back in, and so on and so forth. So where the graduate program is depends. And they're responsible for the graduate programs. And so that's where you can put training in if you want to do it through the graduate programs. And they're also, interestingly, on that side is usually somebody who deals with the academic integrity of students. And I don't know how many of you have run across this issue or not, but what is the overlap between academic integrity and research integrity? So if you cheat, I know at my university, if you cheat on an exam in a course, that is academic integrity, and it may go through up one set of regulations. And if you falsify something on a grant, then that's research integrity or research misconduct, and that goes up through another structure. And often those two are not compatible with one another. So it's interesting how we deal with students, whether they're students or whether they're researchers, and go through. But I mean, I've been and worked with universities in China, in Japan, Singapore, all over Europe, and throughout the United States. And if you have this basic structure in mind, you can generally find your way around any university. And figure out what's going on. And these are the places where integrity will be handled, where there will be efforts to foster integrity. The differences are budget, staff, and the responsibilities assigned to them. So as I said, we may have as many as 100 to 150 people in our regulatory side alone. I mean, at the University of Michigan, we have 5 institutional review boards or research ethics committees. The medical one alone has 80 to 100 members on it, probably has a staff of 25 people who just look at the medical ethics consents, the IRB forms out there. And then we have another one in the social sciences. We have branch campuses. We have a $1.2 billion research budget, so it's a huge establishment there. I work with one office that has over $1.5 million just devoted to training of a group of medical students. So that's on the one hand, and on the other hand, today I asked about within FAPESP, what's the organization like, and a person I talked to afterwards said I was going to raise my hand and say it's me that does it. And I'm sure there's more than that do it at FAPESP, but oh, there you are, sitting right there. Yeah, I couldn't find you, where you were. But that's fairly typical in many universities around Europe now. When you go around and start talking about training, there'll be somebody who will say, well, I'm supposed to do that, but I'm doing this, 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 and this, and the other things on top of it. So it's the budgets, the staffs, and then what responsibilities are given that changes enormously. And then within that, it's how that university functions. What is the culture? So I've done a lot of work, for example, with Oxford University over the years in England. And it's just a pain in the neck because the responsibility for so many things rests with the faculty. And you can't do anything there without going through the faculty and the college system and so on and so forth. And it's very hard to get anything accomplished. Whereas when you go into others, in some of the Asian universities or so on, it's completely top down, and you go to somebody up at the top, and the next day it's done. So that's where the differences are. And when you talk about fostering, it isn't where it's being done, but it's how it's organized and who do you go to and so on. So that's kind of the structure behind fostering integrity. Then if you look at what the options are for what you can actually do to foster integrity, the options are fairly simple. The simple one that's been adopted most widely is to adopt research misconduct policies. And that usually addresses only the worst offenses, so it's a very limited approach to fostering integrity. And the other thing is it's after the fact. It's a response to what has happened. It's not going out front and trying to foster integrity and to prevent it. But that's the simplest thing, and that's what you'll find that most universities have done, if they've done anything else, is to actually put that policy into place. Then the second thing that you can do is you can adopt additional codes of ethics. They're difficult to write, simple codes of conduct for all fields. And here I agree absolutely with Mark. What Mark said is that the professional societies have a big role to play here. My question was a little harsh on authorship because I think they've actually done more on authorship than I said. I mean, they have been important in that. The societies have been important. It's much more difficult for universities to write comprehensive codes that are anything that are more than general. And then, of course, the question is, will anybody pay attention? And that's true of any code of ethics at all, so out there. You write them, you feel good when you're finished, but who reads them? So one of the standard tests I use at the University of Michigan is our College of Engineering has a code of ethics. And every student coming in reads and signs that they have a code of ethics. So you can walk into any engineering class at the University of Michigan and say, what does your code of ethics say about X? And routinely, 90% of the students will say, what code of ethics? You know, they don't even know that it exists. Well, what do you mean? They signed it. Well, they signed it when they enrolled in the university. They were more interested in their housing, their roommate, what courses they were going to take, and someplace along the way somebody shoved a paper in front of them and said, that's the code of ethics, read it and sign it. And what good is a code of ethics under those conditions? So the paying attention is the key there. The one that most universities have started to adopt, and this is spreading over time, is to improve training. And here I'm going to spend a lot of my time today is talking about training, because I want to look at that. It raises the question of actually what do we teach? That's the first question. And then the second question is who does the teaching? And that's the trick, because I think it's fairly universally agreed that the smaller and more personal the setting and the more closely it's linked to the actual research that's being done, the more effective the teaching is. But where do you get all those teachers from? And how do you train all those teachers, because they aren't? So that's the dilemma with training. And then finally, there's the issue of training of the environment, because we know the environment as an impact, so universities can change their environment. But then the question is, okay, what's wrong in my environment, or with our environment at university, and then what do we do to clean it up? And that presents a challenge for universities, but it's one I'm going to address, talk about a little bit, as to what universities can do to start dealing with some of these environmental issues. So as a general picture, that's what universities can do or are doing to foster integrity. The structure is more or less the same. It'll either happen through graduate education or it'll happen through a research office. It'll depend on how much responsibility you give those people, and they can put in a misconduct policy, put in a code of ethics, start to do training, and then take a look at the environment. So those are basically the options that go on. So let's take a look at improving training and then changing the environment. Those are the things that I want to talk about. So training and teaching, okay? The first question that comes up for any university is, do we recommend it or do we require it? So how many are you at universities that have recommended training? One, you're both at the same place. So that's only one vote. Okay. Only one has recommended training. And how many have required training? Okay, 0. Okay, so training is kind of down low on the list. So what's one thing that could be done across Brazil, and I guess is coming because FAPESP is moving in that direction, is obviously to start by recommending training and then eventually using what you don't want to do, and that is the required training. I mean, Mark is right, the regulations will come. You would prefer that it came from within and the universities did what they wanted to, but eventually you may get to the point where they require it. So let's take a look at this. Here's how we went through it in the US. So we required training. The major steps were, it was first mentioned in an institutional report in 1985. And that was an institutional report at the University of Michigan that I chaired. Why were we so brilliant as to think training was something that ought to be mentioned? It's an absolute no-brainer. If people are committing misconduct for one reason or another, what should you do? Well, you ought to train them not to. So it was an obvious conclusion that we reached in 1985 when we were recommending the university, what should you do to foster integrity of research? Well, train people about good research. That became nationally recognized in the US in 1989, and Mark mentioned the report, the Institute of Medicine report that came out in '89. The National Institutes said, oh, you know, we give training grants. And I was at some of those early meetings, and they said, why don't we put training into the training grant application? Okay? After the fact, after you give a researcher money, what can you tell them to do? Well, nothing. They've got the money in their pocket at that point, and they go on and do it. Before they get funded, tell them to do something, and what will they do? They'll do anything you tell them to early on before. So the NIH, the group, was clever enough to say, let's write this in at the upstream stage when they're applying. And you know what? Within about 5 years, everybody in the biomedical sciences that was applying to NIH had a program for teaching the responsible conduct of research. It was an extraordinarily clever strategy. It took no regulatory requirements. It was under simply their grant management. You can do all sorts of things as part of grant management. And they put it in. The community grumbled. Pretty soon, there was boilerplate language out there, standard language. And everybody was happy because they knew what they put in at that point. So the requirement began in 1990s, and it was finally required in 2009 because the US Congress said to the National Science Foundation, we think that you ought to require training. The National Science Foundation had previously resisted that for a long period of time. And in fact, in 2002, when the Office of Research Integrity wanted to require training, Congress told the Office of Research Integrity it could not do it because the scientific community lobbied against the regulation. By 2009, things had gotten so bad that, and I can give you the background for it, that it was actually required. So the results right now in the US is that most universities now offer some training. The approaches and levels of commitment vary significantly, how they actually do it. And it represents a small, usually insignificant component of research budgets. So it's generally done as cheaply as possible, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. So the NIH requirement, as I said, it's linked to funding. It's part of grant applications. It has specific requirements, so that it must be integrated into the research program. How well that's done is anybody's guess. It must be appropriate to the career stage, so not one size fits all. Trainees should assume some responsibility for planning it, which kind of you scratch your head and you say you're training them what to do, but in fact they must plan it. Do you do that in a basic biology course? You must have basic biology if you're going to be a doctor. And by the way, why don't you plan your course in basic biology? So it's a little bit strange that we do that. The faculty should participate, which I think is very important but very difficult to do. It should include just face-to-face, not online instruction. And that seems like a good idea, but in fact, there's absolutely no evidence that face-to-face instruction is better than online instruction. And I'll give you some reasons why online instruction might actually be better than face-to-face instruction. And it will be evaluated as part of the research grant. And that is now done, but it's done very weakly. And there are further clarifications. We came up with an 8-hour figure. So why is 8 hours enough for training and not 6 hours or 4 hours or 12 hours or 15 hours? It's just a number that was picked out of the air. When we wrote the regulation in 2003, we said that you must have at least 3 hours of instruction. That was the ORIs, 3 hours of instruction. How did we come up with 3 hours? Well, there was something in the US called the Paperwork Reduction Act. And the Paperwork Reduction Act says you must calculate the economic impact of every regulation. So we had to calculate what the economic impact of 1 hour instruction was, 2 hours of instruction, 3 hours of instruction. And by the time we got to 3, the number was so large that we couldn't go any above that. We would just been thrown back by what's called the Office of Management and Budget. So we did it on the basis, at ORI, on the basis of what was the economic impact at that point. Where did the 8-hour number come from? Who knows? You know, what is an ideal number? But that's the number that's out there, and that's now the magic number that everybody gets. And you must repeat it at least every 4 years. Why? Well, do you forget what integrity is over a 4-year period? You need to be reminded. The justification there is you probably move to new career stages at every 4 years, and therefore at each new career stage, you should be educated on what is appropriate to your career stage. It's probably the rationale for that at that point. And that's I just gave you the link for that if you want it, and it's in my presentation. The NSF requirement is totally different. National Science Foundation is totally different. It is an institutional mandate, not an individual. So the NIH requirement is on the training grant applicant, the PI who puts that in. In NSF, it's put onto the institution. The institution must do that. And what they must do is, this is a requirement, shall require that each institution that applies for financial assistance from the Foundation for Science and Engineering, research or education, describe in its grant proposal a plan to provide appropriate training. So NSF has always maintained that it should play no role in saying what should be taught or how it should be taught. That should be left up to the institutions, but what you must do is have a plan. So now every institution, when you go to it, if it has National Science Foundation funding, someplace will have a plan, and I'll talk about those plans in just a minute. It covers in ethics and integrity, which is an important difference between the NIH and the NSF. The NSF has always had a broad interest in this kind of social issues that Mark was talking about, social responsibility. Before anything else, they had a social responsibility program. So NSF has always been interested in this, and they put their integrity program with that when it came together. So you must teach integrity and ethics as far as the NSF, whereas the NIH program focuses mostly on integrity issues. There are other programs within NIH, such as the one with the Genome Project, that look at ethical issues associated with it. So it's an important difference, and it has very major ramifications in the US because the National Science Foundation has put in a lot of money to developing resources for teaching. So there will be a big resource center, and the research center will be an ethics and integrity one, not an integrity one alone. So that is a difference. But as I said, the details are left to institution. The NSF has said that it will do audits. So they have claimed that they will go on to a campus and walk up to a student and say, are you funded by the National Science Foundation? If you are, did you have training? So you at least have to do enough training so that when a student is asked if they had training, they remember that they had the training. Okay? Beyond that, will they quiz them on anything? I'm not sure they will, but that anyway. Okay. Elsewhere around the world, and your poll basically agreed with that, is that training is mostly recommended. So this is the European Science Foundation, said institutions and all others who employ researchers as well as agencies or have a duty to ensure a prevailing culture of research integrity. This involves clear policies, training, etc. And that's what's usually said. As an institution, you have an obligation to have policies and to train people on those policies. This is the Global Research Council, and it's a very short one-page summary of the responsibilities. Said research funding agencies should promote continual training in research integrity and develop initiatives to educate all researchers and students on importance of research integrity. So this means that all of the funding agencies globally who have signed on to this initiative presumably buy into this, that they should have something that stresses the importance of integrity, of training. And that's kind of globally where we're at this point, is that it's recommended, but very few have the US requirement. So the only way it impacts you in the US is if you in any way touch US funding. Because if you do touch US funding in any way, any of it comes to your laboratory or program, you, sitting right down here shaking his head, have to provide that training. And it has to meet the requirements. So that's the one place where this is now triggered, and it's all over the world because US funding does go all over the world. One of the reasons I work with some universities overseas is they want to find out what do I have to do to actually comply with US policies, and I go in and help them with that. So the observations are who gets trained. Requirements apply primarily to students and trainees. Most US institutions also require training for researchers. So although our requirements are focused primarily on students, most universities, and I think city, Sergio, you probably know that, they probably do require almost all of their people to take it. So although it's aimed at students, we try to get faculty trained as well. But that's going to be a challenge for you to actually do that. It is not a requirement. The resources devoted to training vary significantly. They rely heavily on volunteers. There's usually some administrative staff to do coordinating. But in Europe and elsewhere, it's usually volunteer and it's usually small budgets. So one of the things I routinely do when I go and I talk to a university, I will say, are you committed to research integrity? Oh yeah, absolutely. This university is 100% behind integrity. Then the next question is, how much money do you actually devote to that? And then you kind of get a look around and what do you mean money? How much money do I put into it? So that's the trick. I mean, for me, that's, if you have a commitment, how does that commitment actually work out in terms of encouraging faculty, rewarding faculty, putting funding in, and so on and so forth. And globally, the resources and training are very, very, very small, which is why I'm skeptical about many of the statements about commitments to technique. There is growing importance, recognition of the importance of training. So I know, Sergio, you work with a lot of Latin American countries and you're talking with them countrywide about what they can do. I'm working with a number of European countries to see what they can do. So there are now more countrywide recognition and there are more institutions that are actually doing it. Biggest question, though, for training is, so what? Does it work? And we're actually getting questions. This is a question that actually recently came up in Ireland. They looked around and they said, hey, we're spending a lot of money on training. Is there any evidence that this is working? And that then is the next dilemma for people who do training. So let me talk a little bit about training at this point. The models for training, you probably know them, but just let me go through them. So initially when we do this, we have to train people. What do you do at a university? You offer a course. So the idea was that you would offer a course, you'd bring in 5 faculty. Mark, do you know anything about authorship? Yeah, come on in and give a lecture on authorship. Do you know anything about data management? Yeah, I do, give a lecture on it. So that was the way we would do it. Chuck everybody through that course, and what do you get at the end of the single course at that? You get trained researchers. Okay? It's a familiar approach to universities. It assures common content. It doesn't assure good content, it assures common content. It may work in small universities. It probably doesn't work in large universities. It's too large and too detached to work in large universities. So it's an interesting approach. It's a good way to start. It starts to raise recognition, but if you have a large university and large people to train, it's not very much, not going to work. So what a lot of universities have done is they've gone to decentralized training. So decentralized training, and this is particularly in the United States, in response to the National Science Foundation. So the National Science Foundation has said, you must have a plan. Oh, what's my plan? Oh, my plan is I've said to my major schools and departments, you must provide training. And you go to the schools and colleges and say, well, what's your plan? Oh, well, I've said to the departments, they must provide training. Oh, that's good. So when you go to the departments, what's their plan? Oh, well, I've said to faculty member so-and-so that you must provide the training. So the plan is to just pass it down through the network and somebody will do the training someplace else. What's the quality of that training? There's no quality control. What's taught? Nobody knows what's being taught. We have a decentralized plan at the University of Michigan. I've audited many of the sessions that are taught. Some of them teach wrong things. Some of them don't even teach what's going on. They do something else in it. But we have a plan, and the plan goes on. So it's closer and more connected to the research, and that's good. To move it down into the research settings is very good. It's difficult to organize and difficult to control, and it needs trained trainers. And this is a topic that's coming up more and more and more globally at this point, is if we're going to do effective training, we need train-the-trainer programs. And there are a couple of trainer-trainer programs in the US. They reach a very small number of people, and we need to do more about that. The third approach is mentors. The gold standard is training always is it's best taught by the mentors. That's what you learn most of your behavior from is your mentors. I've had students in courses that I've taught look at me and say, Professor Steneck, I know what you're telling me, but you don't know what it's like in my laboratory. And that's what I do. I do what I'm taught to do in my laboratory or more setting. So mentors, take a trainee, give them to a mentor, and you have a trained researcher is and somehow the gold standard model that we think ought to work. Okay? It's widely seen. It is directly relevant to the research. And the training comes from a respected person in the field. So all of that is good about mentoring. It's difficult to control the content and the quality, and training depends heavily on the quality of the mentor. And of course, do you have any bad mentors at your university? Maybe one or two, you know, the rare exception of the bad mentor. That's the problem. That's the weakness of the mentor system, is we have no way to actually control the mentors out there. Many mentors have not been trained in the responsible conduct of research. You know, I've sent students back to their mentor and say, you're collecting samples, you want to know who owns the sample, ask your mentor. And the mentor says, well, I don't know who owns the sample. You're taking a course on the responsible conduct of research. Tell me who owns the samples. They haven't been trained in this sort of thing. So again, that's a problem out there. The web is another way. And you know, this is a good model. Take a trainee, send them to the web, and you come up with a trained researcher. The advantages of this, you get uniform content, and that's extremely important because we know from all of the surveys that the in-person training is extremely uneven in what is actually taught. And it's inexpensive, and that's the great thing about it, is it is inexpensive and it's very efficient to do around it. And the other thing is it's easy to document training, which for us in the United States is very important. Because someplace along the end you push a button and it says you're trained. And that goes into a system. And at our systems in the US where everything is handled electronically, that gets put into the section and I can now, guess what? I can now buy animals because I'm trained. But before I couldn't buy an animal. Okay? I can now actually use my NIH grant funds because they've been cleared for me to use. But until I pushed that button, I couldn't do it. So it's really efficient to use. It is also evidence of university concern. A lot of universities are concerned by the fact that they don't look like they're providing training. So they are now providing training. The problem with it, of course, is the impact is questionable. And I'm going to raise that for every single form of training is we don't actually know what the impact of it is all about. One of the things I work with, and I don't want to talk about it, but I work with what's called blended learning. And that's where you start on the web, but the goal is to use the web and the resources to move you back down into an in-person setting. And that is to create an entire structure where you start, you get your uniform content on the web, you get links to policies and on the other way, but then there are plans and materials for taking that back and either doing things your own by yourself or doing it in a class setting, which carries that training on down back into the personal setting. So you use the web as a tool for building and standardizing your training. And I think a lot of universities are using it. I think a lot of programs use the city program in that way. The company I work for, we actually develop blended training programs there. So the major challenge is what works. Training seems like a good idea, but is it? Does training make any difference? Is in-person training really better than web-based training? Are researchers really good RCR mentors? or are they not good ERCOs? There are, unfortunately, no answers to these questions. And there are really no good assessment programs. The Office of Research Integrity in the US has increasingly made this a priority for its grant program. It's giving money to researchers to come up with solutions to this problem, but it's struggling to find good proposals to actually do the measuring and assessment that needs to go out there. Let me just give you an analogy, and I hope this is large enough, but I like to compare this to wellness. What do we do with wellness? Well, we look at what the risks of illness are. We do interventions. Then we usually look to markers. And the reason we look to markers is because what we're interested in are the outcomes, but it's very difficult to measure what the outcomes are. In health and sickness, it's how long did you live and what did you die of. So if you really want to find out what an intervention did, you have to wait until a whole bunch of people die and then figure out what they died of. And in our case, we have to wait until a whole bunch of people get out there and do research, and then we have to see how many of them commit misconduct and whether there's any difference in our training or not. So what you would typically do with heart disease or diabetes is you would say, well, the intervention is lose weight, change diet, stop smoking, take some pills. And then what you would do is you'd look at some markers, obesity, hypertension, plaque, smoking, and so on and so forth. Those are the markers. And ultimately, was there a reduction in heart attacks and diabetes or an increase in life expectancy out there? So the risk of misbehavior, what's our intervention, what are our markers, and what are our outcomes? Well, the risks here are we're interested in misconduct and questionable practices. And we're not sure which ones of these is the most important, but we know we want to get rid of misconduct and we think we want to get rid of questionable practices. The intervention is RCR training, ethics training, mentoring. Those are the interventions. The markers at this point are knowledge, know the rules is one of them. Recognize problems. That's a big one because some people don't even see what the problems are before they get into trouble. Reason morally. We think some of our people get into trouble because they're just bad moral reasoners. Or a sense of professional responsibility. The sort of thing Mark was talking about this morning is instilling that sense of professional responsibility. Those are all markers. Things that we think it's important to do, and if you know the rules, can reason morally, have a sense of professional responsibility, and so on, you will be better. Of course, what we ultimately want to know is there less misconduct? Are there less questionable practices? And are the standards for integrity higher? And that's what's very difficult to measure. Where we're at this point with training is we're debating the markers because there's no agreement at this point on what the markers are, and that, of course, translates back into, well, what kind of training do you actually provide? And the courses vary significantly in what kind of training is actually provided. So looking at this, the providing training, some outcomes, well, one outcome is, I'm going to just go through a series of outcomes. One outcome is simply, I want to demonstrate that I provided training. Okay? So this is something we can actually do. We can have learning management systems that track training and record attendance. We can give tests that track learning. We can do course evaluations that track learners' self-perceptions. Grading provides some measurement of quality assessment out there. So we're good at this. I mean, that's what universities do. We offer courses and we document that people took these courses and they did something. So we can actually document that. Tracking program, we can just document that we have described plans and so on and so forth in the US. So that's the first step. You can actually document to somebody that you do have a training program, which my guess is that most universities right now is in Brazil, you can't actually document that you have training because you don't have the training out there. Okay. Then the next thing is, in assessing this, is to actually ask our learners. I learned a great deal. So that's another outcome. Did you learn anything or did you not learn anything out there? So this satisfies the regulatory requirement that your students think they're learning something. And it actually provides some evidence that you're doing something. And this is important for many people who are trying to do this on a university campus. So you get an administrator who says, I'm getting pressure to do training. Go out and do some training. Sonia, go do some training. And the next year, you go back in and say to the person, asks you, did you provide the training? Yeah, was it any good? Well, yeah, my students thought it was good. So we need that feedback to keep these programs going, and the student feedback also may help us improve the courses. So the normal kind of feedback that we do in courses of asking our students what they thought is helpful in many ways. But it provides absolutely no impact that there's going to be any impact on behavior. So yeah, at the end of a course, the student will tell you, I'm going to change my life. I'm never going to cheat again. Okay? We had a talk at the last World Conference which said, if you want to stop people from lying, you have to tell them 15 minutes before they're going to lie. Okay? Because then there is an impact that they may not lie. Half an hour, 2 days, 2 years, 5 years before they're probably have no impact at all. So it's interesting. We use these things, and as instructors, you really feel great at the end of the course when all of your students say, well, I'm going to change my life. I'm going to be totally different. You won't recognize me in the future. Well, you may not recognize them in the future, but maybe for the wrong reason you don't recognize your students out there. Anyway, I want to go through this fairly quickly. We then go to the more substantive markers issues out there. What are the characteristics of a well-trained professional? So Mark talked about professionals, and we need to create professionals, but what actually are the characteristics of a well-trained professional? Well, presumably knowledge. And again, that was one of the marks of a profession that Mark mentioned, and that was that you must have the technical knowledge to be a professional. So this is something is, do they know best practices? Do they actually move? A second thing, and this is creeping in more and more now in training, is actually competencies. Okay, are they competent or are they not competent? And you can actually test for competency, but it's somewhat difficult. So why markers? The markers are because it's too difficult to measure outcomes, and professional markers are assumed to be linked to integrity. But we don't actually know. So assessing knowledge or tests, I'm going to go through this fairly quickly. You know what the normal assessing knowledge. Assessing competencies is more difficult because you first need to define the competencies, and there now are efforts to do this in research integrity, and it's developing things such as what are called rubrics. So actually, you can't train someone to be a professional until you define what a professional is, and there are now detailed definitions of this that go on through. Mike Kalichman has done this with the responsible conduct of research, and then you develop tests to go through this. I'm actually in the process of developing some online competency testing that's better than multiple choice. Another one that we go to is moral reasoning. We think that moral reasoning is important. Why? Because you can't make responsible decisions until you're a good moral reasoning. Denny Elliott argued a number of years ago that teaching someone to be a moral reasoner doesn't tell you anything at all because you're doing it in an academic setting, and a student will do anything you tell them to do in an academic setting. So if you say at the end of this course you're going to get an A, if you can morally reason like this, the bright students will morally reason like that at the end of the course. Will it have any impact on their behavior? Elliott thought, Denny said, absolutely not, it will not. Other people feel that it's very important, and there actually are tests on moral reasoning that you can give. The bad news is that much professional training actually erodes moral reasoning. So medicine erodes, going through medical training actually erodes your moral reasoning skill. You're a worse moral reasoner when you come out than when you went to medical school. The problem here is that we have so many different objectives that it's hard for actually planning it. Mike McCallichment went through and identified 50 different goals of teaching the responsible conduct of research. Some of them were based around knowledge, some of them are based around skills, some around attitudes, some around behavior, some around community, and we don't know. So markers-based assessment is there's a split between knowledge and professional competency. Some say professional competency is more important, others say knowledge is more important. Moral reasoning is more or less stressed in different courses. There are some courses that are taught are almost entirely moral reasoning courses, and others do absolutely nothing on it. Knowledge is the easiest to assess. That's what you use the most. It requires the active involvement of well-trained teachers, so that's a problem. And markers predict, but they do not guarantee outcomes. So training requires a significant commitment, but we're uncertain at this point about the links between the training and the actual outcome. And that's difficult. It's very difficult for those of us who want to argue for more evidence, more support for training, and we need to do something about that. Climate and behavior. Let me just go through this fairly quickly. What we generally do now to assess climate and behavior is we administer questionnaires. Did you find the course interesting? Has this course improved your understanding? Will you behave more responsibly in the future? What we need to do, as I said, is we need to take two groups of people. We need to train one group and we not train the other group. We need to wait 15 years and then see how they're behaving. And we need informed consent to tell the group that we don't train that they could wind up in jail because they don't know what's right and wrong, and they could do something wrong and it could affect the rest of their life up there. We can't do those tests. They're very hard to do. We have to do the other. So,
in this case, what do you mean by climate?
The conditions around the researcher that are doing it, right? So the compromise here is a little more emphasis on what's called the climate survey or the environmental survey. And that provides different measures depending on the survey. Some of it is self-reported behavior, self-reported perceptions of training, self-reported attitudes towards pressure, and so on. But the coming in and assessing your climate can be a way of short-term seeing what impact you're having on your institution. It can be used as an intervention method. So you can do an initial climate survey. If you're like many universities that don't offer much training, you could, this year, start with a climate survey to find out what your researchers think, what their attitudes are, and so on, and then put in a training program, and 5 years later or 4 years later come back in and do another climate survey and see what kind of changes there are. And some of these climate surveys that are done, you can follow up changes and so on and so forth. I want to show you this one in particular, and this is the Survey of Organizational Research Climate. And this is a climate that was specifically designed by a group of researchers to pull back departmental level information about how your researchers feel about whether they are encouraged and supported in setting high standards for integrity or not. The Survey of Organizational Research Climate. It is freely available. It's difficult to implement, but it's freely available. And anybody who wanted to do that, this is another approach that can be taken at the institutional, the university level, to try to foster integrity. Because you can then go in, it's almost like a health survey, and spot where you have potential problems. The mathematics department, the biomedical engineering department, the history department, whatever it is, where you're getting particularly, and then see what interventions you need to go in and what are doing there. So it is another approach to what universities are doing at that point. I will go through my summary very quickly, and I want to just make one personal observation at the end. That's a kind of high-level approach to training. But as I say, I'm actively involved in developing training. at this point. And for me, the single biggest challenge is how do I engage my learners? Because until I actually get their attention, where do I go from there? And this is where I have a problem and probably a disagreement with some of the people in this field. And that is, I know it's depressing to talk about misconduct all the time. I know it's somewhat threatening to talk about misconduct all the time. But when I think about how do I get the attention of my audience at this point, I just don't think good news has the same impact as some of the bad news that's out there. And the example I'll give you of this is when we were planning the conference in Singapore, the Office of Research Integrity was actually supporting the conference. And I won't say who it was at ORI, but somebody said, and Nick, one thing that's very, very important at this point is I want you to focus on the positive. Don't focus on the negative messages so much in planning that conference. And at the same time, the Office of Research Integrity was putting out a video, the lab, which many of you have seen. What does the lab start with? How many of you have seen it? What's it start with? Bad news. It starts with bad news. The unfortunate thing is, and you know, I'm going to tell Mark afterwards, but it's one of the most inspiring talks I've heard him give, and I've heard Mark give many, many talks. And I'm moved by it. I'm moved by a talk like that. But how do I actually get the attention of my audience? What do I do to do that? So I wanted to just end at this point with a couple of slides, and I won't go through all of this, but I just wrote a course on international collaboration. It's an online course on collaboration. Collaboration is the dullest topic you can possibly think about. You know, you have to collaborate with people. Here are all the things you need to think about. So how do I get attention to it? So, Leo, interesting presentation. Great to see you're making progress. I had high hopes for this project when I reviewed your initial funding application. My team has been pursuing work in this area for a number of years. Typical meeting that happens after it, young person, established researcher up there. Wow, thanks, Professor Chang. I've been pleased with progress we've been making, but somehow things always take longer than expect them to. Still, I'm confident that our original hypothesis is sound and can be proven. My guess is you're right. The trouble is, you can't move forward with this until you have all the evidence, until all the evidence is gathered. As I listened to your presentation, I had an idea that I thought might help. If we join forces, we might be able to speed up your work and wrap up some loose ends on my current work at the same time. What more could you ask for? Opportunity is out there, okay? Opportunity is knocking on your door at that particular point. Then we could be in a great position to put in one of the new innovative collaborative grants we could even do, so on and so forth, big plans. If I must say so, Professor Chang, I wouldn't have expected you would have paid attention to my research and so on. Okay, maybe that's getting ahead of ourselves, but seriously, you should think about it. We've got a couple of pieces missing. You could help us fill in those pieces and so on and so forth. Well, big plans. And this is aimed at researchers who are at the beginning stage of their career moving forward. Next week, back in the lab. So how did the presentation go? Oh, better than you expected. I think no technical hitches, luckily, lots of interesting questions. At the end, even an offer to collaborate from none other than Professor Chang. Really? Professor Chang? Hang on there. I thought we were worried about competition from her group. I've heard that one of her postdocs is doing work that's similar to my research. How much information should we have shared, should we share if we have to collaborate with them? And these are the questions you got to ask at the beginning of any collaboration. Don't worry, Maria. I raised that issue with Professor Chang. She assures me that we'll be able to complete our work much more quickly if we work together than by ourselves. You said yourself that it was taking much more time than we'd hoped. But now you move into the area of mixed feelings with moving forward. Just think about it. We'll have a great position, and now you start thinking forward of all the things you can do. Yeah, I can see the advantage, but I hope you're right about them allowing us to move forward with our own work. I'm sure collaborations speak good opportunities, but as a postdoc, I need to be first author on my own papers so that I can get a regular position. And this is a point I want to make in going through this, is that as a PI, you have obligations to different people. And how are you going to sort out all of these obligations? And that's what the crux of a collaboration is, sorting out your different obligations. Don't worry, you should have been there. Professor Chang was really interested in our work. I'm sure this collaboration will be in all of our best interests. Is this really a good opportunity for me and my team? Professor Chang is widely respected, and she's got so many great connections, but I've heard rumors that she makes overly generous use of other people's work. Did I make the right decision? So I want to put some negative thoughts in their mind. I want to raise some questions in their minds. I want to suggest that there's some negative things out there. I understand the professional aspirations, but somehow I've got to get attention of this busy young researcher to get them to think down the road of collaboration. And I think for all of us, that's the challenge of teaching. We know the material, but the question is, how do we make that other huge audience out there that has other things to do and other ways to spend their time, how do we get them engaged in this topic? And I think if we can solve that problem and get our audiences engaged, after that, I think we'll just have to push them away from the door wanting to come in and get training. But it's that initial challenge that's so important. So anyway, thanks very much, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Nick. I must respond to the last part, because we all know that scandals get people's attention. We know that, we know that, and we know that. I certainly did not want to give the impression that teaching about the problems, the scandals, etc., the warnings, the cautions, and social responsibility are mutually exclusive. They can be part of the same course. I realize it's a challenge to get the right instructor, etc., etc. So you can get their attention by doing what you just suggested and focus a lot on what the professional obligations are and responsibilities, but I see no reason why one cannot also integrate into that the social responsibility. So I would not let people leave this room thinking that they're mutually exclusive. They should be integrated in some way. Students learn differently, different approaches. Someone might start with the aspirational, inspirational, and go to the other. It just sort of depends. I guess you're right. I hope I'm right. And somehow we have to find a way to get our students engaged. And I think some will be more engaged by the negative, some perhaps by the aspirational and inspirational. We have to test those, but they all ought to be part of the same thing. And that's what I'm suggesting, whereas as you well know, in decades past, people gave short shrift to the notion of social responsibility, that we were spending our time on the negatives, hammering that over and over again. So that's the only point I'd like to make.
Yeah. I mean, I was on Mark's committee, Freedom and Responsibility Committee, for a number of years. And as he well knows, for those years, we tried very hard to focus attention on the issue of advocacy. And that actually is, for me, a very important practical way to raise the issue of social responsibility. When you come in at it and say to somebody at a high level, you must be socially responsible, you kind of get a shake of the head and say, well, yeah, sure, fine and dandy. But then when you get down to that level of advocacy, and it's an area where the guidance is very, very thin, and AAAS has actually been trying very hard, I don't know if you've succeeded yet in doing that, but been trying very hard to raise the attention toward that issue. When does a scientist move from being a scientist to being an advocate? And when you move into that realm, what are the rules? that apply to you there. And that's where a lot of people get themselves into trouble. And that leads very logically to the question of social responsibility and how do you mean them out. So, we've been working together for many years, and I agree. But I just get the only way, unfortunately, to initially engage some of these things is with a negative. I'll give one other example. There was a colleague we had who worked for years in engineering ethics, and he got so sick of all of the bad examples of what engineers did that he wanted to write a book based on good examples. To the best of my knowledge, he never wrote the book. He never wrote the book. He could never find, I mean, he's a very thoughtful person, Mike Pritchard, very, very thoughtful person. And he could never find a way to cast a book that would actually sell and do what he wanted to do. I'll give you another example. I just gave a talk to the science journalists, the global community of science journalists in Copenhagen. And they were railing about universities not giving out enough information about misconduct cases. And this was terrible. Universities needed to share their bad information, and they were unethical by not doing it, and so on and so forth. And I looked at them and I said, but at the end, what we know is all you report are the very worst cases, and you put them in the worst light you can possibly do. And they said, well, of course we have to do that to sell newspapers. The public makes us do that. And well, yeah, the public makes you do that, but come on, think a little bit about what does the public make us do as universities and so on and so forth. So you're right, it's a very delicate balance. You don't want to be too negative. I didn't want to say too many things negative in my talk yesterday, but somehow I have to get your attention.
No, I wanted to say that I really enjoyed both presentations this morning, Mark and Nick. And Nick, with what we do in City, I totally agree. I mean, you have a wonderful vision of that. Actually, it's interesting because in our surveys, we see that when people are more happy, just to say a word, about City, it's in those places where City is not mandatory. It seems that where it's mandatory, people feel that there is an obligation to comply, it's just a regulatory issue. But instead, the topic that you raise about social responsibility is quite important in Latin America. Since we're thinking in trying to engage people from Latin America, and one of the problems that we have in Latin America is that there is no data. We don't know exactly what's going on. There is an implicit feeling that something is wrong, but there is no real data about how much or which is the level. Actually, Sonia's paper is one of the few papers that have been written about local problems in terms of the concept of plagiarism. So taking both presentations, I was thinking that maybe we should try to engage for the conference not only the professional societies, but also funding agencies in Latin America. Those have to be important partners, because one of the things that they are lacking here, at least my feeling, is just policy making. They know there is a problem, but how they can address the problem in a way that could be useful for universities or for researchers. And I think that maybe there are important sectors funding research in the region. In Mexico, you have CONACYT, they have their own funding, and they are supporting lots of grants in local universities. In Mexico, you have Carlos Slim and other big donors that they are supporting research as well. And you have other countries like Colombia with less relevance, but in any case, those have funding agencies that are supporting, and maybe we can try to establish some sort of panel, or at least just to establish how to think to develop policies and educational models or training that could be helpful for their people. As of now, as far as I know, and I'm putting Brazil aside because I know that it's a little bit more evolved, there are some discussions, but not any agreement about how to address the problem. And the lack of response from Latin America in the previous conference showed that there is a problem here in terms of how they are acknowledging or facing this situation. So that's.
I agree with that, and I want to raise one issue associated with that, and I've been interested in what others have to say. Raising these issues, there is a cultural factor, a country-wide factor in it. And to just give you an example, working in Europe 10, 15 years ago, if you had East Europeans in the audience and you started to say we need to do more to encourage whistleblowers, you had a group of countries where whistleblowing had such a bad connotation to it. Whistleblowing was so negatively seen because it was reporting on your friends to the communist governments that it really was very difficult to actually raise that issue in that context. Well, you have to come at it another way. You can't come at it from whistleblowing. Another aspect of this is you could look at this as corruption. You know, a lot of the misconduct, particularly if you look at some of the financial improprieties and how this impacts clinical trials and conflicts of interest, you could look at it as corruption. So my question would be, in areas, I want to be very careful here, but in areas where corruption may be more of an issue, how do you delicately negotiate around that and still raise this issue without actually getting into, are we part of the debate over corruption more widespread? And to just give you one more example of that, the director of ORI recently resigned. He was very frustrated by government in the US, and he wrote a very strong letter saying, I couldn't work within the government bureaucracy. It's terrible. Do you know who picked that up in the United States? We have a wing of the Republican Party known as the Tea Party, who what they would like to do is cut government way back because they think government is inefficient. It doesn't do anything. And here's the director of the Office of Research and Integrity saying the government is ineffective, it doesn't do anything, it doesn't waste time, and so on and so forth. So the way we approach it, the way we approach this problem is within the political context. So the question is, within Brazil, how do you delicately and appropriately approach this? And then, as you say, how do you move to Colombia or Venezuela or Argentina or other countries like this? How do you actually raise that without getting caught up in these other issues?
You can escape to that. But you can also escape to the fact that you have to address the issue, because otherwise one could imagine that the university are isolated from the rest of the community. But they're great, I think. And maybe Argentina or Venezuela are not the best examples because corruption is quite endemic. Yeah. And so it's overwhelming, but because also they don't invest on research particularly. Without maybe being very careful, I think that we can engage maybe funding agencies for countries that are investing in research. And maybe it's just for a sense of self-preservation. What you mentioned, a scandal, it's always a problem. It tarnishes reputation. So maybe, and the other positive, you want to put it in a positive way, it's raising quality. So what we do with training, basically, is that it's just creating awareness. I totally agree with you. When we are doing education, we are not creating experts and ethical experts, but what we are doing is just making more people to know about things that shouldn't be done. If we can set that in, we can put that in terms of trying to attract funding agencies and trying to protect themselves from the situation in general and trying to create some rules, maybe that could maybe that could be the way to speak. But I'm sure that they will be also very open about their own governance the problems that they have. So
is there anybody here who, besides Sonia, who teaches responsible conduct of research? Over there. How do you approach it? Can you get a microphone? Yeah. How do you approach it?
It's the same course with her.
Oh, the same course.
This is the course at Copy. I teach another course with Martha at our institute. Okay, okay. Do you do what Sonia?
What was your question again?
What do you teach in the course? Do you teach rules? Do you teach moral reasoning? Do you teach professional responsibility? What's your objective? Give me your 3 most important objectives.
Okay. Since it's to undergraduate students, there is a strong focus on applications like reporting, research, no moral reasoning, and the rest so-so.
Okay. Anybody else?
Because this course at Copy is a combination between research methodology and the responsible conduct of research. Okay. It's a quicker course and extramural. So if you are an undergraduate student, as Renan has just said, you can attend. If you are a graduate student, you can attend. So they are complementary approaches. Okay. But this one that we teach with Martha is totally focused on the responsible conduct of research.
Okay. Anybody else? How many people have actually had a course on responsible conduct of research?
On my sabbatical in Harvard, I had a NIH grant, so I had to do it. But it was a part-time phase, and then the online activation to be allowed to receive the certificate. Okay, okay, you did it.
So now we have one person who teaches, one who took a course. The question is, how did the rest of you learn what your responsibilities are as a researcher, or don't you know what your responsibilities are? We have somebody from University of Brasilia back there, I've heard you. What do you do at your university?
I took some of those courses, not specifically on research integrity, just these departmental courses. But, you know, I think common sense is a very good basis for research integrity. We need to clean up some specific mistakes, but common sense is a good starting point.
I designed a course at the University of Michigan for postdoctoral students. So these are all people who are well into their research. And the objective of the course is they were to identify an integrity issue that they faced in their research, and then to work out what they should do about that. So on day 1, most of them could not identify an integrity issue. So if you said, all right, write down on a piece of paper, what questions do you have about research integrity that you can't answer, you would have nothing on the papers, okay? So then you spend a period of time explaining what integrity is and what all the possible issues are. So on day 2, you get them to the stage of almost all of them recognize that they will have an authorship problem someplace down the road. So if you engage students at any level, you engage them at the level of authorship at that stage, because that's where they're going to run into problems. Then when you sit down and talk with them and start asking questions, you find that there are a whole host of other problems down there that they haven't recognized and they don't know what to do about them. So give you some examples. I'm collecting my data in 3 or 4 different formats. Some is hard copy, some of it's computer, some of it is... Nobody's giving me any guidance on how to link all of my data together. And of course, no universities in the US provide any sources to validate electronic data collection. So you're supposed to, on a hard notebook, sign it and date it, but when you collect it electronically, how do you sign it and date it? You need special software to do that and a special program to do that. Does industry have that? Absolutely. Every industry that's going after a patent or something else has a way of time stamping independently when they do it. Most universities do not. So A, we don't provide students with guidance on how to keep data, and B, we don't provide them with the resources to do it. So what do? They look around and see what's going on, and people are stuffing things in notebooks and piling it here and doing it there and so on and so forth, and those are the practices they pick up. So common sense really doesn't get you through the problem at that point. It doesn't get you through. Another example, a student came to me and he said, I work in the area of the microbiome. Okay? I've just found out that for the first 4 to 5 years of microbiome research, none of the equipment that was used was appropriately standardized. Therefore, most of the early research is not reliable. And the research community has never recognized this. What do I do? What do you tell them to do? So there are a host of problems out there that, I agree, some are common sense, but some aren't. And they require genuine further digging, talking with colleagues and other things to figure out what's going on and what I should do. And these are experienced people who are about to become independent researchers working on their own. There wasn't a one that I worked with over the years who didn't have some issue, an important issue, that they didn't know how to answer, and they didn't know where to get the professional advice to answer that question. So for me as a teacher, solving that problem is our primary problem, getting through that. I sit in on the initiation of clinical trials. And these are things that have been gone through entirely through the system. They've been peer reviewed, they've been reviewed for ethics, and in almost every one, there is an issue that has slipped through that somebody hasn't picked up. And the clinical trial coordinators are sitting there saying, what do I do about this? One of them was a painful procedure that was much more painful than described in the informed consent form. Never described. And yet the nurses had to sit there and hold the person down while a needle was jammed into them and a piece of muscle was pulled out, and so on and so forth. The researcher had never even done that thing. Long way. For me, it's those practical issues that are the most important, because that's where you start to make small compromises in right or wrong or not look at things. And it's very easy to move from that small compromise to the next compromise and the next compromise and so on. What Martinson research has shown us is the people who engage in questionable practices are more likely to engage eventually in misconduct. So stopping our students from moving down that and making sound decisions right at the start is, for me, the most important thing that needs to be done. I mean, that's a long answer, but I mean, as you move toward doing more teaching in Brazil, those are the kinds of issues I think you need to address. How do you help your students in those ways?
When you were beginning faculty member and had your own lab or with students, well, let me start over. How did you learn the basics about doing research? From your mentor or from reading?
I only stayed in hard science research through beginning graduate studies, so I never actually became a full-blown, I'm a historian. And historians are, I mean, what goes on in the sciences is amazing me to a historian. A graduate student comes in, they define their own problem. I don't define problems for them. If you don't know what you want to do, don't bother coming to me as a graduate student. The idea that you come in and fit into a team and you take this little part and you slowly develop is totally foreign to what a historian does at this particular point. But when I was moving in, I learned from the team around me. There was no question about it. There was no training and other things about it. You just learned from that team around you. So, you know, I said at the beginning, we aim most of our training at students, but they're going to go back into their laboratories and they're going to learn from the senior people that are there. So unless you've trained them, everything you teach them in the classroom is going to change and be untaught when they go back into some laboratories. So, yeah, I mean, I have no doubt that you got to get this teaching into the laboratory, and that's where people ultimately do learn it.
Then let me ask another question. Nick asked how many people teach a course, and we found out that only like 2 people teach courses in ethics, research integrity. How many people sit down with their graduate students and tell them some basic things about ethics and research integrity? That's not teaching a course, but you know, it's like one-on-one. Anybody? 1, 2, 3,
now we
4,
start to get more.
5.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes.
How do you approach that? I mean, anybody care? Yeah.
We have here the undergrad students also in the lab, and they have to learn since the beginning. Then every week we have a meeting, and the first topic is discuss ethical issue or something like that, or some procedure in the lab, how to make a notebook or these kind of things. They have to present, and the others will discuss.
I mean, this is an area where universities actually could make a very large difference if they just looked more at the mentoring environments on their campus. What are the quality of the mentors you have? What do they do? And so on. And you can get at that either by doing a straightforward mentor evaluation, which you can do, or you can get at it indirectly by doing these climate surveys that I mentioned. And I know that some of the schools that have done climate surveys in the US have found that there are genuinely departmental differences, that departments take on a characteristic that kind of determines what kind of people come out of that department. And I'm sure you know it, that on your campuses you probably have, quote, problem departments or problem mentors or so on and so forth. So one of the ways to foster integrity is to just deal with those situations.
It sounds like somebody needs to translate the climate survey into Portuguese.
Well, it could be done. Yeah.
The students what?
The students used to read English or understand English.
I mean, I know at the University of Michigan for as long as I have been there, we did exit interviews with every one of our doctoral students. So when our doctoral students left, we sat them down and we talked to them. And I asked one day, what did you do with that information? Oh, we don't do anything with it. We just do it. Well, why don't you do anything with it? Well, if you, year after year, find negative comments about a mentor, but that mentor happens to be your most prominent researcher, what are you going to do? Yeah. So that's the dilemma we have as universities, is changing the culture is not easy because we have other priorities out there. Thanks very much.